Okay, class, welcome to, I don't know, sorry, Kylie, I'm not sure why your little thing is, can you see your name is up here?
Uh, yeah,
I
like
mean,
by the
I don't, yeah, I don't know how to not have that on there. So as you can see, so hi class, we're gonna go through the PowerPoint for um, assessment and scores and technical adequacy of instruments. And hopefully I'm going to review quickly what we talked about a couple weeks ago, and then we'll go on to content we didn't get before, and this should help you um, know what to address when you're looking at your assessments coming up and how to critique them. Okay, so before we talked about the definition of assessment being a broad range of different things. We talked about the goals that assessment can address. I've added a video in terms that talks about the different ways that you can think about assessment in your classroom. So this video here, formative, summative, diagnostic, I kind of elaborated on this slide to help you think about this full range and the purpose that it can play in your classroom. You can think of diagnostic as that initial point. One thing I don't quite agree with what it says in the video is it talks about unit tests or pre-tests as being diagnostic. And they can be in the sense that they're giving you an idea before you teach the content, but diagnostic is more referring to tests like you're doing with Dr. Moskal in terms of IRI's initial, or what does it stand for? The reading inventory, or a more comprehensive battery. You have to think about it as a comprehensive battery of the subject that you're investigating. So diagnostic test of math could be a key math assessment, of reading, like I said, IRI or Woodcock-Johnson's broad reading. Those are somewhat, but diagnostic is not necessarily standardized. Then your formative, again, these are the purpose of the test is to see where students are going over time. And so I like the little symbol they put in there, like at a crossroads. And so you're moving along and you're doing these exit tickets and you realize they didn't quite get formative and summative evaluative assessments. So you stop and you go back and review. Or with my students that are learning to read and I'm adding new sounds, or I'm thinking they need to move up a level, and I test them after 2 weeks of us being at this level, and I realize, oh no, I'm out of their zone of proximal development and I need to step back a little bit. So anyway, a formative in general is that progress monitoring that helps you make instructional decisions. And then summative is that, again, end of the unit or end of the year. It's like, this is it. This is see what they learned in general, and they don't get another chance. Anyway, so take a look at that video. It's helpful. We went over those different kinds of tests. I also added this video to help you think about what a norm reference versus a criterion reference test is and clarify that. That's going to be really key when you look at the different standardized assessments, especially the norm reference piece. And the other thing about this video is it's given like a teacher explaining to parents, so that can also help you with the assignment to figure out how you would explain instruction. So, assessment scores to parents. And so this video also goes into what a standardized score is. Then, okay, we discussed the uses of assessment, and we looked at a bell curve, and these are the different types of scores. So becoming really familiar with that and being able to explain them will be something important for your summative assessment. Okay, can't actually read this one. Quantification of test performance. This is just another aspect of how you're looking at reporting how a student did on a test in terms of percentile ranks and standard scores. I want to make sure that I explained, I don't know if I remember explaining this in class. So when you're thinking about a norm reference test, DIBELS in particular has done this to look at what is the likelihood or predictability of this test as well for later on. And so while we've talked about phonemic awareness and the different other aspects, fluency, decoding, and reading comprehension as being different parts of the developmental cycle of learning to read. What DIBELS has done is looked at what are the benchmarks that tell us that a student is most likely to move to the next level. And in order to do that, they did a norm referenced analysis. So they collected a sample of students at that age group. They administered this test 3 times a year, and then they looked at, they followed these students over time, and they looked at, well, if a student scored, for example, on their letter naming fluency at the end of their kindergarten year, and they scored 20 correct letters per minute, how likely were they then to go on and score well in decoding words in first grade, which is the nonsense word fluency? And how many sounds were they able to produce in that? And so they found that, oh, if students were scoring above, and I'm not going to remember this exactly right, but more or less above 40 letter names per minute at the end of kindergarten, then they were more likely to be progress to that next benchmark on nonsense word fluency and be decoding words and be at grade level in first grade. So the norm referenced meant that you could figure out, oh, this also makes a prediction. So I might come back to this later because we're going to go through how tests do that in terms of reliability and validity here coming up. So we talked about being careful about age and grade equivalent norms, that they should not be confused with performance standards. So just because you go make a year's progress doesn't mean the student's going to make a year's progress on those grade equivalency. So it should not influence, oh, it looks like they scored this year on the evaluation at a 2-point grade level equivalent of a 2.8. So we make their goal to be grade 3.8 the next year. It won't necessarily line up. And so that's why you need your curriculum-based measures as well. Okay, here we get into the new content. All right, so when you're evaluating a test, you're thinking about 2 aspects. Is this test valid, and is it reliable? And you can ask, so here's a list of questions to help you define these different areas that they're defined in the book, and I tried to summarize from general a question that you can always ask yourself. So in terms of content validity, you're asking yourself, do the items on the test measure the content knowledge domain? So do these items actually match? So you were looking at a test about math, and then you came across a test that was a vocabulary question. Was that actually measuring math ability? So if that question is like define perimeter, is that still getting at that? If that's on a general math test, or is that getting at, or you're looking at math facts and it's asking about this perimeter or computation skills, and you have perimeter question, it doesn't exactly match up. So that's one area. Does the content, do the items and the content match? Then criterion related validity is what is the relationship between 2 tests with similar content. So then in a way, that's what I was talking about with DIBELS. And we'll give some more answers in a second. And then construct validity gets at, does this test actually measure the idea or attribute of what I'm trying to measure? And that's especially important when you're thinking about intelligence and cognitive assessments. And in terms of reliability, a good synonym for reliability is consistency. You're asking yourself, how consistent are test scores across testing conditions, situations, and different evaluators? And then these are the few areas that we're going to just keep going over. All right, so I think it's helpful if we have actual student examples. All right, so I already talked about Eddie. I talked about his assessment in kindergarten. For this case, I'm thinking about him as when he was a second grader, just for the discussion purposes. And then this other example student, Anita. So Eddie is a second grade student being evaluated for learning difficulties across all subjects. The multidisciplinary team suspects that he has an intellectual disability. And just to know a little bit about his background, he comes from a working class white family who has often received welfare assistance. Anita is a middle school student who scored exceptionally high in all of her classes, and she's being evaluated for participating in AP classes going into high school, and also the Talented and Gifted program. And she speaks Spanish as her first language and went to bilingual school in Caracas, Venezuela, until she came with her parents to the San Francisco Bay Area, and they teach at a university. So when you're thinking about one of the first things you're asking yourself with these assessments is, who is the student that this assessment applies for, or the other way around, here's my student and which assessments apply to my student. And so for the questions for Eddie, you can be thinking about an adaptive behavior scale, cognitive assessment of some kind to see that he is performing or showing the ability of below 2 standard deviations below the mean. He has concerns of his language development is delayed, and so you would also look at receptive expressive language tests. And then you need to show the academic impact. So of course you would have academic achievement, and you need to have it over multiple different environments. So it's helpful to look at diagnostics and formative assessments. For Anita, on the other hand, we still might be looking at a cognitive assessment because we need to show that she's on the other end of the spectrum to qualify for these for Talented and Gifted, that she's performing above the 95th percentile, and that she's also performing that way academically, and that could be based on a criterion reference test, such as a state assessment, and also a norm reference test, such as the PSAT. Okay, so just keeping those students in mind as we go through what these things are, and we'll come back to their specific cases after this. I did not fully prepare for having water. Oh dear. Okay, so evaluating test quality. Again, this is just restated again what you are considering when you think about validity and reliability. So under validity, you're considering, is it valid test for the student in terms of addressing cultural or linguistic bias, in terms of their age, in terms of the purpose of the assessment of what you're looking for. And you can also look at test validity in terms of the actual content of the test as it stands by itself, not in relationship to a student. So that relates in terms of the construct, like I was talking before. Are you actually testing math if you're asking a vocabulary question? Is that the construct that you want to get at? Or are you testing intelligence in a broad way when you, are you getting at that, what is intelligence? So it's getting at this more like theoretical thought of, do we even know what intelligent considers? And there's the arguments that intelligence is different. There's social intelligence or musical intelligence, and does a test that only looks at verbal and spatial reasoning get at intelligence in general? So that's a more theoretical thought about it. Then you also are considering, is the test in itself valid in comparison to other tests? So like when I was talking about DIBELS being predictive of the next test, those different, each individual tests for DIBELS are predictive of each other. And so they're highly correlated. We'll talk about that word correlated in a second. And then you can look at a test in comparison to itself. And it's actually, is it valid from item to item? Is there that, I don't want to reuse the word consistency. Consistency is reliable, but also are all the items valid? So under reliability, you're looking at across settings and also within the test. And so across settings, you can think about settings vary in terms of who's delivering the test, in terms of the day and time that it was given, and that you can have alternate versions of a test. So our Form A and Form B, they have different questions, but are they similar enough that they would get, a student would take Form A and the student would take Form B and they'd get the same score? So these different, so it's generally considered across tests that and the creation of assessments that there's going to be some kind of error, that the student is not always going to test the same from day to day, or from Form A to Form B, or with Dr. Broughton or Kylie or whoever. There's going to be some kind of error, but the test creators' goals are to make that very minimal. So let's see. So there's something called what is considered the true score and the observed score. And the true score is this theoretical score that the student, that is really what the student can do. And the observed score is what you actually see on any given day. And so this is calculated at a conceptual level by thinking about the obtained score is actually the true score plus or minus error. So either the student had a really great day or they had kind of a bad day, but they're generally going to end up in this range. So we can think of that in terms of Eddie. He certainly doesn't always test the same, and he also doesn't test the same in the morning or in the afternoon, and depending on what he ate or the level of his focus. So the first score we get happened to be after recess. So it ended up being 3 standard deviations below the mean. So it wasn't not his greatest score. Then we test him again and he tests higher and he's almost at the second deviation, so around like 68. When we test him again, he lands somewhere in the middle. So the idea is those are all the observed scores, and the true score is somewhere in that range. So a test will, the standard error of measurement is the amount of error determined to exist using a specific instrument calculated using the standard deviation of the obtained scores multiplied by the square root of 1 minus the reliability coefficient. Don't worry, I won't ask you to do this. But just so you know, that relates to confidence intervals. So that calculation tells us when it's reported on your test and they say like, oh, Eddie's IQ overall is 69 plus or minus, or with a 95% confidence is how you would report it, because there's this 5% of error that it could be a little bit higher or it could be a little bit lower. We don't exactly know. So this is in the middle is what the test is reporting, when the true score could be closer to 70 or it could be closer to 55. All right, on this other end of the spectrum, you have Anita, and again, she could test, she could test given, and this is why validity is really important. So if we give her a test that of academic achievement in English rather than in Spanish, and she's never had instruction in English, then she could score quite lower than her actual true score. So let's talk about these aspects of, is it valid? When you're thinking about validity, again, you're thinking about, one way to think about validity is the criterion that you're measuring. We associate the concept of validity with the extent to which a test measures what it thinks it measures, what it says it's going to measure. So you can decide if a test is doing that in comparison to another instrument. So is there concurrent validity on that criterion? So if I'm measuring reading and I use DIBELS in one test, and the kid scores at the 50th percentile, completely average, but then I give him the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement and he scores with scores of like above the mean, around 115, then I don't have concurrent validity with these two instruments. They might be measuring different aspects of reading, and they don't, instead of the same type of reading. And then I can have a predictive validity. So when I was talking about DIBELS, letter naming fluency has predictive validity for nonsense word fluency, or for later success on state achievement. So that predictability, again, was found out by tracking a student over time. And for example, a GRE is supposed to have predictability for later success in grad school. All right. I think I've kind of addressed content validity and construct validity. Another example of construct validity specifically are the idea that two tests are measuring the same kind of concept. So with the Wechsler's individual scale for children, it's supposed to be looking at intelligence, and you'd hope you get the same type of scaled score on the Stanford-Binet test of intelligence. However, that's why there's, it's still kind of something out in the field, because a test like the test of nonverbal intelligence, to take out the verbal component, which is very strong in WISC and Stanford-Binet, a student could have a totally different score. So I think I've brought up Julian, who was born in Moldova, and that's an example where it was really important that we looked at a nonverbal test. And then also with Eddie, since he has that difficulty, with language delay, we want to find out what are his strong skills that are maybe nonverbal. What does his intelligence look like when we take the language piece out of it? And so we might select a test that doesn't have the verbal subtest, but then we're kind of tweaking our idea of what that construct is of intelligence in general, because we're saying there can be intelligence without verbal, without language. So when you look, in order to engage in this questioning of your test, in terms of content validity, you would take a test and look at what it says it's doing. And then look at the items that are there. Is that consistent with the definition of the content? Does the key math have items that are on math? And then also consider who is been tested. So in the test booklets, it will actually give you all the long researchy mumbo jumbo about who it was norm referenced on and where, and how many years and all of those details. So you can find out if it's been norm referenced on a population that's appropriate for that student. So with Eddie, that's quite easy. We can choose the right norm reference test for him as a young white male. But then for Anita, on the other hand, we can't really be sure. We're not actually comparing her to our other like peers. But we can allow Anita to show us what she knows about criterion for the topic that content is covered on that test. Okay, so construct validity. Here are some considerations to look at. So for example, you might think about the scope of the measurement of this test. So if you're looking at selecting a spelling test, a spelling test that would only measure spelling in terms of the words to, and to would be way too narrow. It wouldn't give us a really broad understanding of that student's ability to spell. But then on the other hand, if we try to ask them to spell every single word in the dictionary, we're taking up way too much time. We're exhausting them. They probably stop spelling after 5 words. So we have to find our little Goldilocks right in the middle, the spelling test that actually selects those indicators of their general ability to spell. So that again is part of construct validity, that how are we sampling at that construct? We can't actually get at all of intelligence, but can we get at a piece of that? All right, and the sun is setting, and I guess you can still see that. I might turn all right, now we're going to think about, is this test reliable? So the reliable, again, the best synonym for reliability is consistency. And it is determined in terms of the administration of a test and some other variable. So we're going to talk about the various different types of variables that you're looking for that relationship between, that consistency. And to measure consistency, we use a statistical term called correlation. So you can think about reliability like a positive consistency, like how in terms of, let's consider cooking lasagna. So the first time you cook lasagna, you have cheese top, tomato layers, really traditional look at lasagna. You follow the recipe to the T. Then you cook it, you think, oh wait, I have more ricotta cheese this time, and so you add more ricotta cheese, maybe do less layers. So your reliability there is not exactly on. They're not exactly the same. Then you cook your lasagna again. Apparently it come out the same. And then you cook it again, and you make some slight more variations to your lasagna. And then you just take out the tomato sauce completely, and then you put the tomato on top. And then you're like, oh, forget the tomatoes. They're just gonna put zucchini layers in there. So your reliability is gone. It's still lasagna, but your consistency is decreasing. Now, negative reliability would be when something is consistently getting more and more different. So this shows, there's a website where you can put in, select different random things and discover that they correlate. So apparently it looks like honeybee producing colonies, as they decreased, juvenile arrests of possession of marijuana went up. So this is a negative, this comes out as a negative correlation, as you can see there, but very consistently negative. One's decreasing, one's increasing. So this describes how you actually obtain that correlation coefficient. They're between -1 and 1. So you can either be highly negatively correlated or you can be highly positively correlated. Those are both strong correlations, even though they're negative and positive. What's not a strong correlation is 0 in the middle. So, oops. Okay, so I basically said that. All right, so again, a positive, here's another example of a positive correlation. I guess my lasagna aspect would be one that's going closer to 0, I'm sorry. The divorce rate in Maine seems to be related to the consumption of margarine. The divorces per 100 people is decreasing, and so is the per capita consumption of margarine at the same rate, almost side by side. So even though they're decreasing, they're both going in the same direction. So that's a positive correlation. So again, the negative correlation is when they're going in opposite directions consistently. The positive correlation is they're going in the same direction consistently. So one of those things that has this apply to student learning, there's been studies on the correlation between phonemic awareness and vocabulary. And again, correlation is about the trend line in the middle. So you can see this dark line is what does it seem like on average students are doing. Not every student falls on that line. So on average, as phonemic awareness increases, students have a higher level of vocabulary, word recognition. And here are some definitions in case I didn't make sense to you. So when you're looking for a correlation coefficient on a test, you're looking for something that is closer to 1. So a strong correlation is considered to be above 60. So 0.60, all of these are strong. 0.38, not so, typically not significant. Okay, so how do you measure test reliability? You can measure the test reliability by looking from test time over time. You can measure reliability by looking at two of the same test but different forms of it, slight alternate form. You can split the test in half. This is also internal consistency, and you can compare even and odd scores and see if there's consistency within the test across those scores. You can have inter-rater reliability. So if I deliver the test and someone else delivers the test, we get the same scores from the same student. Or if I do the checklist and the teacher does the checklist, that we have the same observations about that student. So again, norm references tell you who is this test for. So when you're considering this criteria, come back to, are we testing the student who this test was developed on? Is that consistent? And that's especially important for our students of color and who have different home languages than English. All right, so finally, we want to take these and apply them to what considerations might come up for Eddie and Anita. And so going back to Eddie's list of types of tests, I still need to be aware of his home culture and what he might have been exposed to in his family experience, being in low socioeconomic status, and the other difficulties that his parents face that really keep them at home and not out in the community. I also need to consider his verbal ability, and then aspects of his personality that I know how he varies across setting. His ability looks different throughout the day in small group versus in the whole classroom. And so because of those things, when I'm choosing the appropriate test for him, I'm thinking about how to get at his academic achievement. I both want to look at a diagnostic test, and I also want to look at what he's doing over time. What is his trend line? What is his average? And so I might use a curriculum-based test to get at that. In terms of intelligence, like I brought up before, I'm thinking about how his verbal ability is quite low, and that might drag down his score. And I want to really find out what his strengths are. So a test of nonverbal intelligence, the TONI, might be more appropriate in my selection for him. And then the other aspect is adaptive behavior scale, and even thinking about the items on there. Are the items really getting at what is adaptive for him, appropriate for him in his home, and what he's had the opportunity to learn? And that can also be, Eddie in particular, his family wasn't sure how to potty train him. And so he was still struggling with that into first grade. Now, that is definitely an important adaptive skill for going to school. However, I want to take that into consideration when I'm interpreting his scores. And then likewise, I would want to consider that as well in terms of cultural values, and that the adaptive behavior skill is based on the expectations that we have in the United States and European countries, and not necessarily the same expectations in other countries. For example, teachers have reported about parents coming to school and hand feeding their student into first grade. And in certain cultures, that's something that mothers are expected to do until the student is older. All right, in terms of Anita, again, I want to think about her home culture, her home language, her exposure to the content that I'm delivering to her, and also the opportunity to compare her to other peers that are similar to her. If I don't have the tests that actually give me those options, then I just need to take that into consideration when I'm actually reporting the scores. And so my expectation tonight is that you get time to watch this video before next Thursday, that you go ahead and read the article by Skiba and do the forum post under the special topics presentation, create a new form in there, and put in the ticket for the in-class activity on like one paragraph describing how you would interpret assessments for a parent. Hope you had a nice day off. See you later.